let everybody have a moment to take their seats. Ooh. The parrot is engaging in the conversation at this point. Well, welcome back, everyone. As you know, some of you came a little later, so you've perhaps observed that I'm not Glenn Wharton. I continue not to be Glenn Wharton. I'm Casey Mallinckrodt. But I'm actually, and unfortunately Glenn has a terrible cold and really couldn't come today. We're hoping he'll be here tomorrow, but I'm experiencing a little bit of schadenfreude. I hate to admit it, but I have the opportunity in just a minute to introduce Ellen, which is an honor I don't deserve, but I'm grateful to have. But first, we have a little bit of business. We will have free time after 5 o'clock to visit the museum and the garden, which you may have seen if you come out and look down and you see the beautiful sort of canopies of bougainvillea, the Robert Irwin Garden, and Glenn encourages you not to miss the museum, but encourages you to stroll through the garden. Also, please come back to the restaurant at 5:45 for a reception, and then we'll have dinner at 6:30 also in the restaurant. And a reminder that tomorrow morning's session starts at 10 o'clock. And now, as I said, I get to indulge in the schadenfreude moment of being able to introduce Professor Ellen Pearlstein to deliver the symposium's keynote lecture on the role of conservation in determining feather provenance, and for all of us to further celebrate Ellen as a friend and a colleague and a mentor. Thank you, Ellen.
Wonderful. Well, I won't even begin to start to say how heartwarmed I am about all of this. It's been truly extraordinary, and I know that it will continue to be so tomorrow, so I will save those remarks for tomorrow. But yes, my title comes very much from sort of a long-standing research and interests, but also more recently developed perspectives, and I'll explain what I mean. Let's see. Okay. So provenance has multiple meanings and is the subject of multiple publications, meetings, funding opportunities, symposia, a whole broad array of activities. And from the Getty Research Institute, you see on this slide that provenance is defined as coming from the French word provenir, which means to come from. Provenance is the history of ownership of a valued object, such as a work of art. A full provenance provides a documented history that can help prove ownership, assign the work to a known artist, and establish the work of art's authenticity. And I think this is a widely understood definition. And I just want to do the briefest possible shout out. My contention here is really to talk about why are Indigenous community members and conservators absent from informing provenance studies. So that is I'll just plant that so you can reflect on it. I do want to, though, even on proceeding on that topic, point out that there have been some absolutely extraordinary conservation and curatorial and archival collaborative projects, and one at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, in which our own Casey Mallinckrodt, who you just heard from, participated in a provenance research project on African art in Virginia's collection. And also just a shout out to my Fowler Museum colleagues at UCLA, who similarly teamed a conservator and a curator and an archivist to study provenance on their African collection. So I just want to definitely tip my hat. So I was talking about the fact that there is vast amounts of funding now and other such kinds of opportunities to support provenance research. You have it, Bird. Okay, so beginning with countries in Northern Europe where artwork was seized by Nazi looters, I would say this is probably the core, the kernel that's started driving provenance research, and extending to other countries more recently implicated for illegally held materials from Benin, the Kingdom of Benin in Africa. So we've come to see government and private funding becoming available throughout Europe for these efforts. And I'm just kind of pointing out to you here on this slide that there's at the top is a quote from a Swiss, somebody connected to the Swiss Ministry of Culture talking about their funding opportunity. And then there's a German Lost Art Foundation commitment of $2.17 million for provenance research. And then finally on the bottom, just showing you a Franco-German fund that was just effectively passed for the study of objects originating in sub-Saharan Africa. So there are all these are very generative. Many different projects are coming out of such funding. And however, there have been efforts toward indigenous or ethnological collection provenance that is also being both generated but also criticized. And I'll just share this with you. Ethnological or so-called ethnographic collections face particular provenance problems. Institute for Ethnology scholar Jessa Grimm declares to us that often very little is known about the specific situations pertaining to their acquisition, such as the societies or places of origin for these items. And then next she tells us that the magnitude of these collections, which are notoriously vast, do not allow for a determination of the individual provenance for every item. That's also problematic. And finally, a moral, ethical evaluation of the acquisition and the context for that acquisition and linking that to legitimacy of ownership. That's problematic as well, and I believe that point has to do with the fact that provenance research has been highly deemed to be a legal process, and that legitimacy of the record and legitimacy of ownership are taken as a kind of a firm declarative outcome for provenance research. And in fact, as I've been taught by my archival colleagues, including Anne Gilliland, who I'll do a shout out, who is here, the legitimacy of the archive is something we should not at all be taking at face value. And therefore, using the kind of accumulation of records, for example, there still needs to be a moral, ethical evaluation of what this all means. Next, I'll move to another set of colleagues, Furmeister and Hopp, published in the Getty Research Journal. They're asking, what do we really hope to accomplish when provenance research is rushed? And I too must have to say that I would be an advocate for slow provenance research as opposed to fast provenance research, because in terms of fast provenance research, and I'll just kind of allude to their quote, they're saying a fundamental question that needs to be asked is whether it makes sense in such a complex and demanding field of research to work within a framework of 1, 2, or 3 years. And my point here is that what do we lose when conservation material expertise and indigenous knowledge are lost from this project, and they frequently are when it's seen as a legal framework. So I did an informal survey on a global listserv of conservators, and I asked people about their involvement in museum provenance research. And there was a small but very impassioned number of respondents who shared their frustrations about being absent from all aspects of provenance research, but in some cases, they even shared their work. And I'm going to share with you an example that was shared with me by a colleague, and I'll get to that in just 1 minute. But I also wanted to point out that archivist colleagues and anthropologists have been publishing about this dilemma of relying on the archive, in particular when it comes to indigenous cultural heritage. And this is a blog called the Boas Blogs, named for Franz Boas. And this particular issue was devoted to exactly this question. So it's been extremely interesting to learn from. So again, now I'm going to turn to, I'll have 3 case studies for you. The first will be a case that was shared with me by a respondent to this outreach that I did. And especially as I want to be focusing on featherwork, obviously, in these studies, in these cases. So conservator and professor Valentin Boissonnet performed research, and I should say Professor Valentin Boissonnet is in Switzerland, and he is at Neuchâtel at a conservation graduate program. And he performed research on these spectacular feather mosaics that you see on the slide. And these are mosaic panels that are from Papua New Guinea. They originate from Papua New Guinea. Their provenance, so strictly determined provenance, is known through correspondence and publications of their early Austrian collector, anthropologist Richard Thurnwald, who collected over 100 of these items, and of Friar Franz Kirschbaum, who collected with Thurnwald, so they were kind of working together for a certain portion of time. And Kirschbaum himself collected 22 of these mosaics. These mosaics are now in museums all over Germany, England, Switzerland. They're at the Vatican, and they're in Australia. They all came from these 2 major collections. And were distributed from there. These mosaics have been identified by Boissonnet as panel types, as you see here on the left, and paddle types, as you see here on the right. Through conservation research to identify the wood and material evidence for the paddle type on the right, or not this particular one, but another, these types were found to be made from wood repurposed from canoes. So there was suddenly a whole additional material history for these items. Conservation research has also facilitated the identification of all of the feathers on a small number of examples of both of these types of mosaics. So I should also just point out to you that these feathered mosaics were in use and collected along the Karam River, which is a tributary to the Sepik River that you can see which the Sepik River runs through much of northern Papua New Guinea. And I hope you can see, I don't know where maybe this is the pointer. Yeah, maybe, let's try. No, okay, well, you'll just have to trust me. In that rectangle at the top, I hope you can see the Sepik River. It's kind of indicated, the text is in blue. It's also the case that these feathered mosaics were documented as being collected at the Marienburg and Camball missions in Papua New Guinea, and they too are part of that, within that rectangle. Swiss conservation graduate student Lorraine Michelade, working with Boissonnet, identified the feathers from one mosaic as belonging to a species endemic to southern Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and that is, the Eclectus roratus parrots, and you see those parrots on the lower right. This research sets the stage for furthering provenance research to include not just the collection site for the items, but for the materials used for their completion. Again, push it back and get it to a community, right? Why would we not do that? This deepens the concept of provenance to include the value, sourcing, and circulation of feathers as a significant cultural commodity. So in this slide that you're looking at, you can see the central image. It is a detail of some of the feathers that were being examined by Michelade. And the top right map is the particular locations in southern Papua New Guinea and on the Solomon Islands where this particular parrot is found, you know, where it undoubtedly had been sourced. A second such feathered mosaic was examined in a totally separate campaign by conservator Martina Brunori at the Vatican Museums, who I had the pleasure to work with in 2022. While the same Eclectus parrot feathers were found by our Vatican colleagues on this mosaic, collected contemporaneously, but this one was collected by Kirschbaum, as you can see in the text. Other feathers identified on this particular item include the Victoria crowned pigeon, an unidentified species of hawk, and the Stephens emerald dove, as well as, however, and in addition to the Teresian crow, and I have the Latin names, but I'm not dwelling on them right now. Often also identified by Brunori, working collaboratively, is the northern dwarf cassowary that you see on the lower center image, and also the Australasian purple swampfin. Now, the purple swampfin, and I'll just click to bring your attention, shows a distribution concentrated most heavily in northern Australia to the south of Papua New Guinea. By contrast, the northern dwarf cassowary, again indicated here with a distribution map, shows a distribution restricted to northern Papua New Guinea, northernmost Papua New Guinea. Again, these identifications help deepen our understanding of the circulation of these significant cultural commodities. A further study of a larger corpus, building on the work of these two colleagues, might locate feather selection and use within specific communities identified through their feather selections. So I guess my point is that even when post-collection ownership history is very well known, the interdisciplinary and highly collaborative field that is conservation of cultural heritage, which has the capacity to pull together specialists as diverse as those in this symposium audience, I might add, might help us push provenance back to a level that I would argue is more significant. So, Now I'm going to turn to the second case study, but this is an example of my own research. This is an example of featherwork, totally lacking in provenance. It's a blanket. It was brought to me for examination by a California tribal museum a number of years ago. In 2004, the museum had purchased this feather blanket, which, like many museum items, had very little available information about its origin at all. The blanket had changed hands between private individuals before being purchased. It's a fragment. Technical examination indicates that only two sides have selvages or finished edges, and the other two do not. However, we can safely estimate that the intact size of this, we can know that the size of the fragment was 27.5 by 19 inches, but it was not likely to be much bigger, as the evidence indicated. It turns out that the materials and construction of this blanket were the only way to understand its origins. There's virtually no other way. There are no records to trace. For right now, I just want to point out that the vertical cords you see in the detail are wrapped, it's plant material, vegetable material, wrapped in feathers. And the white traces that you see in that detail are the interiors of the shafts or quills of the feathers. So feathers have not only, as some of my previous speakers have pointed out, feathers have not only a long history of use because of their remarkable decorative aspects, but they're also very warm. I think Sherry kind of pointed out the lovely California blanket. And they have been used in feathered blankets, have been used interchangeably with animal fur to produce wearing blankets in the Americas. And on the left in this slide is Captain Tom. And he was from Auburn, California, and a member of a Central California Maidu tribe. And he is wearing both a flicker feather headdress, which Sherry has also shown us previously, and a rabbit skin robe or blanket, a full body rabbit skin robe or blanket. And this photograph was taken in 1874. On the right is a Paiute rabbit skin blanket made by Charlie Kaiser before 1929, and this is in the collection of the Autry Museum here in LA. So evidence indicates that rabbit skin blankets certainly were very widespread in the Americas. They occurred in the Southwest, the Great Basin, the Plateau, California, the southern Northwest coast, as well as Central America and parts of Canada. And you can see each of those regions indicated on this map. And they also have great time depth. The earliest fur blankets have been found in burials dating to well before the Christian era. And there's a quote here from Ken Hodges, who was the former archaeologist at the San Diego Museum of Man, now the San Diego Museum of Us. And Hedges stated in 1973 that this quote about fur blankets having been used in Western North America for the last 10,000 years. So why am I talking so much about fur and rabbit fur blankets when the subject is a feathered blanket? Well, there's a huge amount of technological overlap between these two formats. And the image on the left here shows how rabbit skin, again, going back to the fur blankets, was cut into 2-inch wide strips and wrapped around or wound around plant fiber cordage. And the prepared skins would shrink on drying, and the fluids in the skin would adhere it to the vegetable fiber cordage, so there needed to be no supplementary attachment material. Both feather and fur cord blankets were constructed before the development or the use of a loom in the Americas. And so both types of blankets use what is called a twining method, where wrapped cords served as the warps, and I hope you can see in those blue arrows, there are the vertical cords, and perpendicular weft cords are applied with a twist around each warp, which I'm indicating here in the red arrows. And this twist around the warp is actually the definition of a twining technique. So this is a pre-loom twined construction that is used for both fur and feather blankets. Next, I really smiled when Sherry showed us an amazing image of a inappropriately displayed California feather blanket with the wrong gendered headdress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But these are also examples of these California feathered blankets. And these are examples. The one on the right is in the American Museum of Natural History. The one in the center is at the Denver Art Museum on display. And the one on the left, I have to admit, I'm forgetting and didn't put in my notes, but I'll check anyway. So a question that occurs here is, what are the feathered blankets that have any kind of historical precedent in California? Because the community that had purchased the blanket that I was studying were hoping that there was a strong and continuous California connection for that particular item. Well, excellent research by Sally McClendon, emeritus anthropologist and linguist from Hunter College in New York City, really started off a way to study these blankets. She studied, she indicated that there are 14 extant feathered blankets from California in 11 museums worldwide, 5 in the US and 9 throughout Northern Europe and including Russia, as Sherry showed us. All were collected with very limited information. McClendon found evidence to suggest that these California feathered blankets could all be traced to 4 communities, and I will show you that on the subsequent slide, and that they all date to the 18th or 19th century. And the reason they could be so traced was because they had been given as gifts to military and entrepreneurial high-ranking visitors, including Gold Rush hero John Sutter, who came to California, as we all know, from Germany to pan for gold. And interestingly, the missionary and military archives and the papers associated with the recipients of these gifted blankets, they provided the paper trail, along with ethnographic and linguistic research. However, these blankets were also studied technologically, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So I show you this kind of tribal map of California to point out to you the 4 communities in north central California with whom these California blankets are associated, and they are the communities indicated here. So the Patwin, the Concow, the Nisenan, and the Miwok. And the black meandering line east of the Patwin is the approximate location of the Sacramento River. As I mentioned, the National Museum of Natural History owns one of these blankets, and it's part of the Smithsonian, and ornithologists at the Smithsonian had been dispatched to identify the feathers on their blanket. And these feathers are apparently found consistently through all these California examples. There have been comparative studies. The communities that made these beautiful blankets live close to the Sacramento River basin, have a history or tradition of bird trapping, so it is no surprise that the blankets are made from waterfowl feathers. And this is a female wood duck, and you're seeing two different sections of the body that have been, where the feathers have been harvested for use on a feather blanket, and these details are mine from direct study of that blanket for comparison purposes. And the beautiful feathers in particular that you see in the top center and right are referred to as verticulated, or I think it's verticulated because of that kind of beautiful herringbone patterning. In addition, the male wood duck, who is the showier of the two, isn't this the most beautiful bird? I like the wood duck male wood duck always gets me. But they produce purple iridescent feathers in small patches on their wings, and these too are found in use on these beautiful blankets. And those are, again, photos that I captured of the one that I studied. So suddenly we have some information about a grouping of beautiful feathered blankets from California. And we know that they're waterfowl. Even before McClendon's research, anthropologist Charles Willoughby at the Harvard Peabody Museum examined in the 1920s 3 blankets from collections in the US, and he noted that each of them had been made with a red, heavy, braided cord at one end. And I'll just highlight that for you. So you see it in my image capture, the red braid, and then you see his drawing, Willoughby's drawing. And then cow hitch knots were consistently used to secure the doubled weft cords in place at one end. And so you can see those in reality and diagrammatically. And finally, knotted pendant cords finish off these blankets at the opposite end from the red braided end, and you can see what those look like as well. McClendon found that these features were prevalent on all 14 of the extant California feathered blankets, and you can certainly, I hope, see that for yourself here. So what is the relationship of the feather blanket I was studying to this long tradition in Native America of fur and feather blanket construction? Well, starting with the comparative evidence found by these blankets in the Americas, and in particular in California, I looked at this example to identify materials and construction and hopefully place it in a technological tradition. So I started by examining the feathers using microscopic samples, and which kind of gave themselves to me. You know, the conservators in the room will know what self-sampling means when a sample just presents itself. And mounted on a polarized light microscope, you can look closely at the shapes of the nodes on the barbules. And looking at this, I made my own assessment. You see the slide on the lower right. I made my own assessment, but then I further sent on the example to ornithologists at the Smithsonian, who had, in fact, really been the creators of this technique, this forensic technique for identifying. And it allows you to identify to the family, just to the family, not to a particular bird, but to a group of birds. And so this particular shape of nodes on the barbule identified this as a galliform. That is the family of birds that includes turkey, chicken, or pheasant. And when we looked at this and we looked at the coloration of the feathers and other properties of the feathers, it seemed quite clear that these are wild turkey feathers. So the wild turkey, Meleagris scalopovo, is a bird that is native to Central America and Mexico, and it did populate the southwestern United States in the pre-Hispanic period, but it was not actually widespread in California until it was introduced as a food source in 1912. And so this map, which is showing in green areas where kind of pre-Hispanic or pre-Columbian areas where the wild turkey had populations, is showing a very scant distribution in California, but it's much more prevalent elsewhere in the country, and more so in the Southwest United States too. Another feature of our blanket is a knotted bundle of hair found in one corner. I used a sample of this hair and various microscopic techniques to measure its width and structure, including the size and shape of the central void, known as the medulla. And you can see the image on the top right is showing you a transmitted light image of this, this hair under polarized light, and the central medulla is that dark void space in the center. And then at even higher magnification with a Getty colleague and access to a scanning electron microscope, we could identify the distinct pattern of the surface scales on this hair. So all of this evidence taken together suggests that that hair is human. And again, I worked collaboratively with my colleagues at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Forensics Lab, where they also deal with human forensics. And indeed, this was confirmed to be human. I clarified the structure of our feathered blanket by taking an X-ray, simply to allow us to more clearly see its twine structure and to more clearly see the absence of a heavy braided edge across, but going into those loops across the top at the selvage. So this has got a very simple looped selvage. And there's no evidence of cow hitch knots. And in fact, the construction of our blanket most closely resembled archaeological fur blankets, fur cord blankets that I could find published in, different, essentially archaeological reports, not necessarily the secondary literature, but the primary literature for archaeological reports. The other aspect of the other thing that we looked at for this particular example is to look at the vegetable fiber cordage that is used to construct this blanket under study, and the twining fiber. And in producing a cross-section, sometimes the longitudinal section is fine, sometimes a cross-section is more useful. In this particular case, we produced a cross-section, and our fiber is in the bottom right, sort of looks slightly more orangey, the cross-section, but it shares many characteristics with yucca or agave, whose cross-section you see right above it. And while obviously agave and yucca are ubiquitous in the California desert, and as they are in the American Southwest. But interestingly, on the California feather blankets that had been previously studied by others, they all exclusively use Indian hemp or dogbane, a very different plant material. It's cultural decision-making. Finally, our blanket was collected with a bag of associated soil, which, already there was much about this blanket's condition that very much suggested it came from a burial environment and not, a more recent historical past. This bag of associated soil, I essentially called on a UCLA then doctoral student who was specializing in paleobotany. And I said, would you have a look at this soil for me, please? And would you mind sifting it and seeing if you could pull out any identifiable plant materials? That was done. These samples were sent to another colleague who is a specialist in Western plants, and that colleague identified 2 juniper leaf buds, which, again, according to that plant specialist, would be much more likely to occur in the American Southwest than in California. Not that juniper doesn't grow in California, but it's the preponderance of evidence placed it further into the Southwest United States. So as I mentioned, looking for parallel examples in the Southwest led to reports about systematic excavations taking place between 1920 and 1975, and lo and behold, turkey feather blankets had been recovered in dry caves in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and Oregon. And this is an example of a parallel, not the one we were studying, but this is a feathered blanket, very likely wild turkey, with twined construction that was found in, not systematically excavated, but found in Canyon de Chelly National Park, and it is presently owned by the Navajo Nation. It was loaned to the Maxwell Museum at the University of New Mexico, who are stewarding it for the Navajo Nation. So the fact that these blankets have some indication of having been found in cave burials, and the fact that our particular blanket is quite small, it is likely a child's blanket, and in fact it is believed now through all this research to be from an ancestral Puebloan burial, which places it between 200 and 800 AD. So it's, in fact, the owning museum, which is a tribal museum, had started the process to repatriate it to an ancestral Puebloan community rather than keep it themselves. But I want to also make the point that, like other important cultural traditions, the construction of turkey feather blankets has been a tradition that's been renovated or reinvigorated in the Southwest. So this is an image from 1981 of Hopi artist Ramona Sakiestua creating a turkey feather blanket. And this occurred only after she studied excavated blanket fragments found in Bandelier National Park in New Mexico. So, and now, in fact, this national park and others in the Southwest offer feather blanket making as part of a public program to teach people about this amazing tradition. I should also say that these blankets, we've heard from extraordinary creators of feathered works, and the incredible number of feathers that are included, and Ramona also talks about this, the amazing number of turkey feathers that are needed for any one blanket. But this is also a technique that involves the production of very long feather-wrapped cords, which become the warps for these, which, as you saw in the earlier images, the warps are in the case of the blanket that I was studying, the warps are the the vertical elements, and these are twined crosswise, with weft elements, but it is amazing how long that continuous warp of wrapped feathered cordage is. Actually, they can be like 200 feet long. And part of this study was also trying to figure out how many times there had been an addition of an additional, bit of warp included in, just to really see the amazing construct for this incredible item. So, so just to say that, not only does this kind of deep investigation kind of further assign these items to particular communities and particular traditions, but it also allows communities to revitalize these traditions, because these materials are extant and clarified, let's say. So the final case study I'm going to share is also includes eagle feathers, which I know were also mentioned previously by Andrew and others. This is an eagle feather war bonnet headdress, a format that I think many of us are familiar with. It is totally lacking in provenance, completely lacking. It's currently held by the Museo delle Civiltà in Rome. There is a kind of an anecdotal belief that it entered the collection around 1865, but there is no connection to the donor, no connection to where it was collected, why it was collected. However, it fortunately received an extensive recent conservation analysis and treatment by a graduate student at the Istituto Centrale per il Restauro, which is a very prestigious conservation institute in Rome. The students speculated that the headdress is of a style known as standing up, where the top feathers are secured to extend straight up from a brow or headband, which is separate from a trailer that extends down the back. And I think you can see that with the mannequin and the organization of the feathers above the brow band. Although this young conservator speculated that the headdress might be Blackfeet, the gap between conservation practices in Italy and the US, and I know this is, we talked a little bit about this, where Renee also pointed out just how challenging it is to, try to reach communities, indigenous communities in the US, given the distance, et cetera. But no indigenous communities were contacted to enable exchange with the possible communities of origin for this particular headdress. And you can see, sorry, I should have pointed this out. So Giacomo Perna is shown here on the left, in the left slide, and he is in the museo. And in the middle, between myself and Giacomo, is Serena Franconi, who's a wonderful conservator at the Museo di Civiltà, and she actually facilitated my access to this war bonnet and to meeting Giacomo. And you can see Giacomo's master's thesis on the right, and we had extensive, and it's in Italian, which was also not too much fun for me, but anyway, we managed. But we discussed his thesis at length, and we talked about how might I assist in promoting community collaboration and provenance research, furthering the provenance research. So war bonnet headdresses, there is no provenance research that I would call easy, and I defer to my colleagues in the audience who do this work. But war bonnets are amongst the most widespread and also one of the most appropriated forms of feathered indigenous regalia. And I'll just show you a series of images here. So historic war bonnet, again, historic war bonnet, different format. And then we start to move toward appropriation, right? Maybe more appropriation. And then finally, in 2022, when I was in Rome for an extended period, you know, the offering of a war bonnet to the Pope, which was highly contentious amongst indigenous communities, some of whom felt that this was very warranted and, you know, important, and some felt that it was really inappropriate. So anyway, I'll leave that. But due to the exceptional documentation compiled by Perna and my own compilation of documentation of images that I captured while I was in Rome, I was able to come back to the US and reach out to over a dozen communities that have been associated with war bonnets across our United States, you know. And I reached out to communities using a kind of a snowball effect. Like I'd speak to one person and they would say, I don't think this is ours. Please consult with the following. I think it might be theirs. So I extended from the Central Plains to the Plateau region in the Northwest United States and got many, many astute and interesting suggestions. The most profound for me came from Nez Perce leader and scholar Philip Kashkash, who made significant observations about what the feathers can tell us about provenance. Duh, like what, right? I mean, right. So he confirmed my original kind of guesses that our feathers were from the bald eagle rather than from the golden eagle, which the golden eagle is privileged in war bonnets, but we know bald eagles are also highly revered and also used in war bonnets. But Philip confirmed that on our war bonnet headdress, they were from a bald eagle, but from a juvenile. And why do I bring this up? I bring this up because, as our bird biologist colleagues know very well, birds change their plumage dramatically throughout their lives. And these images are to show you a 3-year-old juvenile on the far left, and then an adult, and then another image of a juvenile. And you can, I hope, see the differences between the appearance of the plumage. I mean, the much more extensive mottling on the juveniles, and the much more stark black and white on the adults. Kashkash further pointed out, and I'm going to quote him, the eagle feathers at the crown are uncharacteristic. They're not tail feathers. This is meant to point out that feather bonnets that utilize eagle feathers are commonly made from black and white tail feathers at the crown. This one does not do that. However, the trailer shows some black and white tail feathers. And in fact, the total count of tail feathers on this headdress comes to 12, which is the exact number of tail feathers on an eagle. Based on this is again Philip, it looks like the maker of this feather bonnet used only one eagle carcass and its feathers to create this headdress. He or she may have also borrowed wing feathers from another carcass to fill in the trailer or brow areas. Discussions like this, when connected to further discussions, further scholarship about more traditional war bonnets or the evolution of war bonnets across time and space, and also further discussion with U.S. Fish and Wildlife ornithology colleagues, placed the production of this unprovenanced war bonnet into the late reservation era of between 1935 and 1960, which is a far cry from 1865, as believed by, as anecdotally. Cheyenne scholar Leo Kilsback, who also consulted on this headdress, tells us that traditionally, spiritual leaders captured eagles from hilltop pits throughout the plains. The birds were kept until they molted 3 times, and then they were released. War bonnets were made almost exclusively of immature golden eagle tail feathers. A full bonnet required 24 to 36 feathers, tail feathers. Since an eagle has 12 feathers per tail, a full bonnet required 2 or 3 tails or 2 or 3 moults from a captured eagle. And that spiritual leaders in the late reservation period began to make war bonnets from 1 tail and a number of secondary wing feathers because of lack of access and lack of privilege in terms of the sort of the seriousness of spirituality was waning in that period due to interaction, just religious interaction. So what do we think about this war bonnet? At the end of the day, I never could actually assign it to a particular community. First of all, the beaded forehead band looked like it was added later on. So even though some community members commented on the style and of the beadwork, I was nervous because it was added later on, and we don't know when it was added, because there were no earlier images either. One of the things that we actually thought about briefly, just briefly, is that this war bonnet may have been produced for a Wild West show, because Colonel Buffalo Bill Cody brought his Wild West show to Italy in 1906 with an extensive tour that included Florence and Rome and Milan, and then he brought it back. I have to lean over and read. Right. He brought it for the first time in 1890 with a long tour, and then a second time in 1906. And we have many accounts of the incredible popularity of the Wild West show amongst Italians and their great ardor for this performative work. So really my conclusions are not so much that the outcome of this war bonnet was completely confirmed, but I'd like to again close by where I started, which is to advocate for including indigenous cultural descendants in provenance research for their regalia, and also to include conservators and their interdisciplinary tendencies for ways of working to extend the notion of provenance research to beyond a legal documentation of ownership, which is great if you have it, but to a more nuanced understanding of cultural histories, material cultural meanings, and I really am hoping that these case studies have persuaded you in that direction, and I'm just going to share some references and thanks, yeah. So these are just some of the work that I cited that isn't cited directly on the slides. The number, and you can see Kilsback work here, and Willoughby, but I think McClendon might be earlier, anyway, but because some of the citations are in the slides and some are here. And then the war bonnet images that I shared with you, going from the historical to the modern, are also credited here. And I just want to thank you so much. Yeah. . Oh. You guys. Well, we're supposed to have a little bit of time for Q&A, but I don't know if anybody has any burning questions. Otherwise, we can talk about it over cocktails, I mean, but I think I don't know if anybody has any burning questions. Anyway, I'll just say I would love to engage because there's such a cross-section of expertise here, and I'm so grateful to have all of you here that I would love to, hear your thoughts, your critiques, all of the above. So, but I know that we are, let's see, I'll help Casey here by saying that we are, we can wander around the museum at the restaurant. So if people would like to see the museum, I guess it's open till 5:45, and this is a great window of time to go do it. And then we'll see you all at the restaurant for cocktails. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.